Let's talk about USAID because there's a lot of confusion about what it is, what it does, why it exists, and most of that confusion comes from the people who work for USAID. I've read a lot of books on this subject because I've been involved in this space for more than 20 years, and the relief and development industry is massive and self-perpetuating. Now, USAID's been involved for years around the world. Let's talk about what they are meant to do. USAID is an intentional misnomer. It's not a government-run charity. It's not like the Red Cross. It's not even really just a philanthropic organization run by the United States government. USAID stands for Agency for International Development. Now, why would the US government spend $44 billion a year on developing other countries? Well, there is a method to this madness, and it's called soft power. If you want to influence the world in your favor, one of the ways to do it is to send your military overseas to sort of threaten and menace everybody into doing what you want them to do. Military would be hard power, or you can use soft power. And soft power is in bringing the carrot instead of the stick. So you go to a country and you say, hey, it looks like you got a lot of people that are coming down with Zika virus. How about we hire a bunch of your kids, give a bunch of kids summer jobs, and we'll send them around and help you wipe out the Zika virus in your country. Isn't that nice of us? So we get goodwill. We're building goodwill for America, which goodwill for America is a good thing, not a bad thing. I'll talk more about the right way we could do that, or a better way we could do that. But the U.S. Agency for International Development invests in things around the world, and by so doing, improves the image of the United States in the world's eyes. Makes people like America. Makes people say, hey, America's a good country. They're nice to us. They help us with things when we're in need. They bring us food when we're having a shortage. And they do that in such a way that it redounds to the benefit of the United States, at least tangentially. Does that make sense? But over the last 10 or 15 years, the mission of the U.S. Agency for International Development has started to slip. And it started to slip because it has been politicized by the left. Most of the people who work in aid and development are, I would say, at least a plurality of those people come from the left because they're college educated and they got indoctrinated at college, at university, about the wonders of socialism and how terrible capitalism is, and how to paint your hair blue and burn your bra and protest everything good and decent and wholesome in the world. Most of the people who are in aid and development went through that same brainwashing mill that I did, but many of them just sucked it up like good little students and believed every word of it. They get into aid and development, and when you look at what USAID has turned into, well, for example, the U.S. invested hundreds of billions of dollars in Afghanistan. We spent $1 billion a week on average for 20 years. Add that up. Much of that was overseen by USAID. Reports indicate that massive amounts of that money was lost to waste, fraud, and abuse. Very few of the projects delivered their intended outcomes. They were doing quote unquote nation building projects. So we're in a country that has been around for 6,000 years. And yet the Afghans have yet to figure out paved roads, light switches, indoor toilets even. They haven't figured any of that stuff out, and their belief system tells them that Allah put you on this earth in the situation that you're in, and doing anything to try to better your situation is an affront to Allah. Because if he wanted you to have cars, he would have given you cars. So to some extent, it was lost just due to that worldview, but to a greater extent, it was because the Taliban would show up. We'd start a building project to do a micro hydroelectric plant somewhere. And after they got started and they had all the equipment in there and they were digging and grading and doing whatever they needed to do to build this thing, this guy would show up and say, hey, I'm your friendly neighborhood Taliban representative and just want you to know we need 15% of your budget if you want all that equipment to be operational tomorrow. And these companies would pay those bribes to the Taliban. You ever wonder why we lost the war in Afghanistan? It's because we were funding both sides. The Taliban didn't need near as much money as we did to continue prosecuting their side of the war. So 15% of that budget was just fine for them. And these companies that got the contracts to build these building projects, they just would price that into their bids. They knew they were going to have to pay it. So they just increased their bid by 15%. They all did it, and they all paid it to the Taliban. So USAID was a conduit through which the Taliban was given a lifeline in order to survive long enough for us to get tired of fighting and leave. And then the Taliban just waltzed right in and took over. If that doesn't set your hair on fire, I don't know what will. Well, this will. The Iraq Community Stabilization Program through USAID gave $644 million to international relief and development for jobs and a public works program in Iraq. Audits revealed that millions of dollars may have been siphoned off by the insurgents, leading to a suspension of the work due to evidence of many phantom jobs and that's financial support. What's a phantom job? Well, we're paying this sheikh to keep his tribe on our side. We're just buying his loyalty. It's easy to do in Iraq. And so he would say, well, you know, how much will you pay per soldier I bring to you, you know, that I keep from fighting you? And they're like, we'll pay this much. And he says, okay, fine. I've got 100 soldiers. And they're like, okay. They just write a check and they just send it to him. Well, they didn't really check on any of that. Come to find out, he might have had 1,500 soldiers, and he was just making up the rest and pocketing the money, the paychecks for all of those fake soldiers. That was happening in Afghanistan as well. A lot of that was done through USAID. Did you know that Afghanistan was or is the #1 exporter of illegal heroin around the world? There's no other country on planet Earth that makes and ships as much opium to the world illegally as Afghanistan does. Burma is #2, but they're a distant second. The only reason that you can grow poppies in Afghanistan, most parts of where it's grown, especially in the south, if you've ever been there, it's not an area where anything would grow. It's just dust, and it's like talcum powder dust. And most of that dust is probably goat dung, just powdered over the centuries, okay? And it's super, super dry, super hot, and yet when you fly over, you see these irrigated patches of land that are just green and beautiful and lush all along the rivers. And come to find out that in the 40s and 50s, USAID came in and dug all those canals in Afghanistan to make all of that land arable so that they could plant crops there. Now, their idea was they would plant wheat and corn and rutabagas, but instead, it's a lot more profitable to plant opium. So Afghanistan would not be the #1 exporter of illegal heroin today if it wasn't for some boondoggle project by the U.S. Agency for International Development. What I'm getting at is that these things often have second and third order effects, all these programs that we just can't plan for. And they end up coming back to bite us in the sometime later on down the road. Let's move on. In the 1990s, USAID was implicated in funding programs in Peru that this is mind-boggling, led to the forced sterilization of about 300,000 indigenous women. What program thought, hey, that's a great idea. Let's sterilize forcibly 300,000 indigenous women. You see, that's part of the problem. USAID is full of people who believe that children are a terrible thing for the environment. Children are just the worst thing ever. Having babies? Oh, that's so last century. We're enlightened now. We know better. Babies are bad. So a lot of USAID programs pushed abortion, contraception, even forced sterilization on countries all around the world. And that brings me to another point. USAID is the primary mouthpiece for the US government abroad. And when we have a leftist government like the Biden administration or the Obama administration, then what USAID is going to be doing is parroting that leftist propaganda to the world and trying to force countries that are very, very deeply religious to accept things like the gay agenda. They would fly LGBTQ flags out in front of the embassy here in Panama, in Nigeria, in places where it is culturally an absolute affront to them, just to try to show them, this is what enlightenment looks like, everyone. We know better than you do. Your culture is so backwards. You still encourage your women to have babies. How stupid could you be? You need to learn from us in America. We just stopped having babies and we just use all our money to get fat. And so we have a massive epidemic of obesity in the United States. We have a declining birth rate. We can't fund our own Social Security program because we killed off all the kids that would have been working to pay taxes to do that. Weren't we smart? Don't you want to be smart like us? And that's what USAID turned into. So I'm going to recommend that if Donald Trump, under Secretary Rubio and the Department of Government Efficiency, has said that they would like to completely get rid of USAID, not because the United States shouldn't have any way to extend soft power abroad, but because it is rotten to the core.